Elza reads A Game of Thrones by George Martin. Chapter 11. Daenerys. Daenerys Targaryen wed Khal Drogo with fear and barbaric splendor in a field beyond the walls of Pentos, for the Dothraki believed that all things of importance in a man's life must be done beneath the open sky. Drogo had called his Khalasar to attend him, and they had come, 40,000 Dothraki warriors and uncounted numbers of women, children, and slaves. Outside the city walls they camped with their vast herds, raising palaces of woven grass, eating everything in sight, and making the good folk of Pentos more anxious with every passing day. "My fellow magisters have doubled the size of the city guard," Illyria told him over platters of honey duck and orange snap peppers one night at the manse that had been Drogo's. The Khal had donned his Khalasar, his estate given over to Daenerys and her brother until the wedding. "Best we get Princess Daenerys wedded quickly, before they hand half the wealth of Pentos away to sell swords and bravos," Sir Jorah Mormont jested. The exile had offered her brother his sword the night Dany had been sold to Khal Drogo. Viserys had accepted eagerly. Mormont had been their constant companion ever since. Magister Illyria laughed lightly through his forked beard, but Viserys did not so much as smile. "He can have her tomorrow if he likes," her brother said. He glanced over at Dany and she lowered her eyes. "So long as he pays the price." Illyria waved a languid hand in the air, rings glittering on his fat fingers. "I've told you, all is settled. Trust me. The Khal has promised you a crown and you shall have it." "Yes, but when?" "When the Khal chooses," Illyria said. "He will have the girl first, and after they are wed he must take his procession across the plains and present her to the Dosh Khaleen at Vast Dothrak. After that, perhaps, if the omens favour war." Viserys seethed with impatience. "I piss on Dothraki omens. The usurpers is my father's throne. How long must I wait?" Illyrio gave a massive shrug. "You have waited most of your life, great king. What is another few months, another few years?" Sir Jorah, who had travelled as far east as Vast Dothrak, nodded in agreement. "I counsel you to be patient, your grace. The Dothraki are true to their word, but they do things in their own time. A lesser man may beg a favour from the Khal, but must never presume to berate him." Viserys bristled. "Guard your tongue, Mormont, or I'll have it out. I'm no less a man. I'm the rightful lord of the Seven Kingdoms. The dragon does not beg." Sir Jorah lowered his eyes respectfully. Illyria smiled enigmatically and tore a wing from the duck. Honey and grease ran over his fingers and dripped down into his beard as he nibbled at the tender meat. "There are no more dragons," Dany thought, staring at her brother, though she did not dare say it aloud. Yet that night she dreamt of one. Viserys was hitting her, hurting her. She was naked, clumsy with fear. She ran from him, but her body seemed thick and ungainly. He struck her again. She stumbled and fell. "You woke the dragon!" he screamed as he kicked her. "You woke the dragon! You woke the dragon!" Her thighs were slick with blood. She closed her eyes and whimpered. As if in answer there was a hideous ripping sound and the crackling of some great fire. When she looked again, Viserys was gone. Great columns of flame rose all around, and in the midst of them was the dragon. It turned its great head slowly. When its molten eyes found hers, she woke, shaken and covered with a fine sheen of sweat. She had never been so afraid, until the day of her wedding came at last. The ceremony began at dawn and continued until dusk, an endless day of drinking and feasting and fighting. A mighty earthen ramp had been raised amid the grass palaces, and there Dany was seated beside Khal Drogo, above the seething sea of Dothraki. She had never seen so many people in one place, nor people so strange and frightening. The horse lords might put on rich fabrics and sweet perfumes when they visited the free cities, but out under the open sky they kept the old ways. Men and women alike wore painted leather vests over bare chests and horsehair leggings trimmed with bronze medallion belts, and the warriors greased their long braids with fat from the rendering pits. They gorged themselves on horseflesh roasted with honey and pepper, drank themselves blunted fermented mice milk and Illyria's fine wines, and spat jest at each other across the fires, their voices harsh and alien in Dany's ears. Viserys was seated just below her, splendid in a new black wool tunic with a scarlet dragon on the chest. Illyria and Sir Jorah sat beside him. Theirs was a place of high honour, just below the Khal's own blood riders, but Dany could see the anger in her brother's lilac eyes. He did not like sitting beneath her, and he fumed when the slaves offered each dish first to the Carl and his bride, and served him from the portions they refused. He could do nothing but nurse his resentment, so nurse it he did, his mood grown blacker by the hour at each insult to his person. Dany had never felt so alone as she did seated in the midst of that vast horde. Her brother had told her to smile, and so she smiled until her face ached and the tears came unbidden to her eyes. She did her best to hide them, knowing how angry Viserys would be if he saw her crying, terrified of how Khal Drogo might react. Food was brought to her, steaming joints of meat and thick black sausages and Dothraki blood pies, and later fruits and sweet grass stews and delicate pastries from the kitchens of Pentos, but she waved it all away. Her stomach was a roil, and she knew she could keep none of it down. There was no one to talk to. Khal Drogo shouted commands and jests down to his blood riders and laughed at their replies, but he scarcely glanced at Dany beside him. They had no common language. Dothraki was incomprehensible to her, and the Khal knew only a few words of the bastard Valyrian of the Free Cities, and none at all of the common tongue of the Seven Kingdoms. She would even have welcomed the conversation of Valyria and her brother, but they were too far below to hear her. So she sat in her wedding silks, nursing a cup of honeyed wine, afraid to eat, talking silently to herself. "I am blood of the dragon," she told herself. "I am Daenerys Stormborn, princess of Dragonstone, of the blood and seed of Aegon the Conqueror." The sun was only a quarter of the way up the sky when she saw her first man die. Drums were beating as some of the women danced for the Khal. Drogo watched without expression, but his eyes followed the movements, and from time to time he would toss down a bronze medallion for the women to fight over. The warriors were watching too. One of them finally stepped into the circle, grabbed a dancer by the arm, pushed her down to the ground, and mounted her right there as a stallion mounts a mare. Illyria told her that it might happen. The Dothraki made like the animals in the herds. There is no privacy in a Khalasar, and they do not understand sin or shame as we do. Dany looked away from the coupling, frightened when she realized what was happening, but a second warrior stepped forward and a third, and soon there was no way to avert her eyes. Then 2 men seized the same woman. She heard a shout, saw a shove, and in the blink of an eye the araks were out, long razor-sharp blades, half sword and half scythe. A dance of death began as the warriors circled and slashed, leaping toward each other, whirling the blades around their heads, shrieking insults at each other clash. No one made a move to interfere. It ended as quickly as it began. The araks shivered together faster than Dany could follow. One man missed a step, the other swung his blade in a flat arc. Steel bit into flesh just above the Dothraki's waist, and opened him from backbone to belly button, spilling his entrails into the dust. As the loser died, the winner took hold of the nearest woman, not even the one they had been quarreling over, and had her there and then. Slaves carried off the body, and the dancing resumed. Magister Illyria had warned Dany about this too. "A Dothraki wedding without at least 3 deaths is deemed a dull affair," he had said. Her wedding must have been especially blessed. Before the day was over, a dozen men had died. As the hours passed, the terror grew in Dany, until it was all she could do not to scream. She was afraid of the Dothraki, whose ways seemed alien and monstrous, as if they were beasts in human skins and not true men at all. She was afraid of her brother, of what he might do if she failed him. Most of all, she was afraid of what would happen tonight under the stars, when her brother gave her up to the hulking giant who sat drinking beside her with her face as still and cruel as her bronze mask. "I am the blood of the dragon," she told herself again. When at last the sun was low in the sky, Khal Drogo clapped his hands together, and the drums and the shouting and feasting came to a sudden halt. Drogo stood and pulled Dany to her feet beside him. It was time for her bride gifts. And after the gifts she knew, after the sun had gone down, it would be time for the first rite and the consummation of her marriage. Dany tried to put the thought aside, but it would not leave her. She hacked herself to try to keep from shaking. Her brother Viserys gifted her with 3 handmaids. Dany knew they had cost him nothing. Illyria had no doubt provided the girls. Eerie and Jiki were copper-skinned Dothraki with black hair and almond-shaped eyes. Dorea, a fair-haired, blue-eyed Lysanne girl. "These are no common servants, sweet sister," her brother told her as they were brought forward one by one. "Illyria and I selected them personally for you. Ira will teach you riding, Jiki the Dothraki tongue, and Dorea will instruct you in the womanly arts of love." He smiled thinly. "She's very good. Illyria and I can both swear to that." Sir Jorah murmured and apologized for his gift. "It is a small thing, my princess, but all a poor exile could afford, he said as he laid a small stack of old books before her. There were histories and songs of the 7 kingdoms she saw, written in the common tongue. She thanked him with all her heart. Magister Illyria murmured a command, and 4 burly slaves hurried forward, bearing between them a great cedar chest bound in bronze. When she opened it, she found piles of the finest velvets and damasks the 3 cities could produce, and resting on top, nestled the soft-clothed 3 huge eggs. Then he gasped. They were the most beautiful things she had ever seen, each different than the others, patterned in such rich colours that at first she thought they were crusted with jewels, and so large it took both of her hands to hold one. She lifted it delicately, expecting that it would be made of some fine porcelain or delicate animal, or even blown glass, but it was much heavier than that, as if it were all of solid stone. The surface of the shell was covered with tiny scales, and as she turned the egg between her fingers, they shimmered like polished metal in the light of the setting sun. One egg was a deep green, with burnished bronze flecks that came and went depending on how Dany turned it. Another was pale cream streaked with gold, and the last was black as a midnight sea, yet alive with scarlet ripples and swirls. "What are they?" she asked, her voice hushed and full of wonder. "Dragon's eggs from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai," said Magister Illyria. "The eons have turned them to stone, yet still they burn bright with beauty." "I shall treasure them always." Dany had heard tales of such eggs, but she had never seen one, nor thought to see one. It was a truly magnificent gift, though she knew that Illyria could afford to be large. He had collected a fortune in horses and slaves for his part in selling her to Khal Drogo. The Khal's blood riders offered her the traditional 3 weapons, and splendid weapons they were. Hagar gave her a great leather whip with a silver handle, Kohola a magnificent arak chased in gold, and Quotha a double-curved dragon bow taller than she was. Magister Illyria and Ser Jorah had taught her the tradition of refusals for these offerings. "This is a gift worthy of a great warrior, blood of my blood, and I am but a woman. Let my lord husband bear these in my stead." And so Khal Drogo too received his bride gifts. Other gifts she was given in plenty by other Dothraki. Slippers and jewels and silver rings for her hair, medallion belts and painted vests and soft furs, scent silks and jars of scent, needles and feathers and tiny bottles of purple glass, and a gown made from the skin of 1,000 mice. "A handsome gift, Khaleesi," Magister Illyria said of the last after he had told her what it was. "Most lucky." The gifts mounted up around her in great piles, more gifts than she could possibly imagine, more gifts than she would want or use. And last of all, Khal Drogo brought forth his own bride gift for her. An expectant hush rippled out from the centre of the camp as she left her side, growing until it had swallowed the whole Khalasar. When he returned, the dense press of the Dothraki gift-givers parted before him, and he led the horse to her. She was a young filly, spirited and splendid. Dany knew just enough about horses to know that this was no ordinary animal. There was something about her that took the breath away. She was grey as the winter sea, with a mane like silver smoke. Hesitantly she reached out and stroked the horse's neck, ran her fingers through the silver of her mane. Khal Drogo said something in Dothraki, and Magister Illyria translated. "Silver for the silver of your hair, the Khal says." "She is beautiful," Dany murmured. "She's the pride of the Khalasar," Illyria said. "Custom decrees that the Khaleesi must ride a mount worthy of a place by the side of the car." Drogo stepped forward and put his hands on her waist. He lifted her up as easily as if she were a child, and set her on the thin Dothraki settle, so much smaller than the one she was used to. Dany sat there uncertain for a moment. Nobody had told her about this part. "What should I do?" she asked Illyria. It was Ser Jorah Mormont who answered. "Take the reins and ride, you need not go far." Nervously Dany gathered the reins in her hands and slid her feet into the short stirrups. She was only a fair rider. She had spent far more time travelling by ship and wagon and palanquin than by horseback. Praying that she would not fall off and disgrace herself, she gave the filly the lightest and most timid touch with her knees. And for the first time in hours she forgot to be afraid. Or perhaps it was for the first time ever. The silver-grey filly moved with a smooth and silken gait, and the crowd powdered before her, every eye upon them. Dany found herself moving faster than she had intended, yet somehow it was exciting rather than terrifying. The horse broke into a trot and she smiled. The Dothraki scrambled to clear a path. The slightest pressure with her legs, the lightest touch on the reins, and the filly responded. She sent it into a gallop, and now the Dothraki were hooting and laughing and shouting at her as they jumped out of her way. As she turned to ride back, a fire pit loomed ahead, directly in her path. They were hemmed in one on either side with no room to stop. A daring she had never known filled Daenerys then, and she gave the filly her head. The silver horse leapt the flames as if she had wings. When she pulled up before Majesty Lyria, she said, "Tell Khadrogo that he has given me the wind." The fat Patoshi stroked his yellow beard as he repeated her words in Dothraki, and Dany saw her new husband smile for the first time. The last sliver of sun vanished behind the high walls of Pentos to the west just then. Dany had lost all track of time. Khadrogo commanded his blood riders to bring forth his own horse, a lean red stallion. As the carle was saddling the horse, Viserys slid close to Dany on her silver, dug his fingers into her leg, and said, "Please him, sweet sister, or I swear you will see the dragon wake as it has never woken before." The fear came back to her then, with her brother's words. She felt like a child once more, only 13 and all alone, not ready for what was about to happen to her. They rode out together as the stars came out, leaving the colour sun and the grass palaces behind. Khadrogo spoke no word to her, but drove his stallion at a hard trot through the gathering dusk. The tiny silver bells on his long braid rang softly as he rode. "I am the blood of the dragon," she whispered aloud as she followed, trying to keep her courage up. "I am the blood of the dragon, I am the blood of the dragon." The dragon was never afraid. Afterward she could not say how far or how long they had ridden, but it was full dark when they stopped at a grassy place beside a small stream. Drogo swung off of his horse and lifted her down from hers. She felt as fragile as glass in his hands, her limbs as weak as water. She stood there, helpless and trembling in the wedding silks, while he secured the horses, and when he turned to look at her, she began to cry. Khadrogo stared at her tears, his face strangely empty of expression. "No," he said. He lifted his hand and rubbed away the tears roughly with a calloused thumb. "You speak the common tongue," Dany said in wonder. "No," he said again. Perhaps he had only that word, she thought, but it was one word more than she had known he had, and somehow it made her feel a little better. Drogo touched her hair lightly, sliding the silver blonde strands between his fingers and murmuring softly in Dothraki. Dany did not understand the words, yet there was warmth in the tone, a tenderness she had never expected from this man. He put his finger under her chin and lifted her head, so she was looking up into his eyes. Drogo towered over her as he towered over everyone. Taking her lightly under the arm, he lifted her and seated her on the rounded knock beside the stream. Then he sat on the ground, facing her, legs crossed beneath him, their faces finally at a height. "No," he said. "Is that the only word you know?" she asked him. Drogo did not reply. His long heavy braid was coiled in the dirt beside him. He pulled it over his right shoulder and began to remove the bells from his hair, one by one. After a moment, Dany leaned forward to help. When they were done, Drogo gestured. She understood. Slowly, carefully, she began to undo his braid. It took a long time. All the while he sat there silently, watching her. When she was done, he shook his head, and his hair spread out behind him like a river of darkness, oiled and gleaming. She had never seen hair so long, so black, so thick. Then it was his turn. He began to undress her. His fingers were deft and strangely tender. He removed his silks one by one, carefully, while Dany sat unmoving, silent, looking at his eyes. When he bared her small breast, she could not help herself. She averted her eyes and covered herself with her hands. "No," Drogo said. He pulled her hands away from her breasts, gently but firmly, then lifted her face again to make her look at him. "No," he repeated. "No," she echoed back at him. He stood her up then and pulled her close to remove the last of her silks. The night air was chilly in their bare skin. She shivered, and goose flesh covered her arms and legs. She was afraid of what would come next, but not for a while, but nothing happened. Khadrogo sat with his legs crossed, looking at her, drinking in her body with his eyes. After a while he began to touch her, lightly at first, then harder. She could sense a fierce strength in his hands, but he never hurt her. Held her hand in his own and brushed her fingers, one by one. He ran a hand gently down her leg. He stroked her face, tracing the curve of her ears, running a finger gently around her mouth. He put both hands in her hair and combed her with his fingers. He turned her around, massaged her shoulders, filled a knuckle from the path of her spine. It seemed as if hours passed before his hands finally went to her breast. He stroked the soft skin underneath until it tingled. He circled her nipples with the thumbs, pinched them between thumb and forefinger, then began to pull at her, very lightly at first, then more insistently until her nipples stiffened and began to ache. He stopped then and drew her down onto his lap. Then he was flushed and breathless, her heart fluttering in her chest. He cupped her face in his huge hands, and she looked into his eyes. "No," he said, and she knew it was a question. She took his hand and moved it down to the wetness between her thighs. "Yes," she whispered as she put his finger inside her.